Good day and good afternoon to our welcome to our weekly COVID update of the 24th of November. Glad to be with you again. I'm going to deal with two main topics today. Two topics I think a lot of people are very concerned about, and it's reflected in the questions which are coming in as well. And that is the issue of the increase in cases which we're seeing, and this is a harbinger, a portent of the much anticipated, much concerned fourth wave. And secondly, I'll talk about the vaccine boosters. So let me get straight on to the slides. Right. If you look at the epidemic curve, sorry, it's a little bit old, as from the beginning of the month, but it really shows the same thing. We are still in the interwave period of the epidemic curve. Overall, nationally, the figures are pretty low. But if you look at the daily cases over here, something's starting to happen more recently over here. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. I'll enlarge it a bit over here. You can see there's now starting to be, excuse me, an uptick of cases. And really what I want to talk about is, what does this mean? Well, if we look at the hospital admissions, in fact, it is still pretty low. It's not reflected in the what's called the DATCOV. The DATCOV is a program that the NICD runs, which looks at the admissions of to hospitals, private and public hospitals, and that is still at a pretty low level. The other parameter which we look at is the percentage of tests which come to the laboratory which are positive. So there's these orange bars over here are the second last week of October, these blue bars the last week of October, and the green bars the first week of November. And there's been a progressive decline in the percentage of tests coming to laboratory which are positive. That's also a very good sign of the extent of viral transmission in the population. And although some provinces are still above the threshold of 1%, 1% is like an arbitrary threshold above which we start really getting concerned. Gauteng province, the green bar, pretty well below the threshold of 1%. Some of the other provinces hovering at this threshold of 1%, the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. It's still overall relatively low. But this is really what is really starting to really be of concern. Remember last week, the daily cases, the daily new cases, reported 273 daily new cases. The previous update on the 3rd of November, 169. This last week, or should I say the last 24 hours, not last week, last 24 hours, 18,586. So a huge increase in the number of cases, still well below the average of daily cases, but certainly a very significant increase of daily cases. So this is really starting to be of considerable concern. Another parameter of concern is we look at, I think I mentioned it last week, one of the surveillance instruments that are used is looking at wastewater surveillance, in other words, sewage, water. And there's a program throughout the country, laboratories throughout the country, where they try and isolate viruses which are excreted into the wastewater. And COVID, although it's a respiratory infection, the virus is excreted into the gastrointestinal tract and into the stool, and then gets into the wastewater. So this is quite an important, quite a precise and also an early sign of virus activity in the community. And here you can see in Pretoria and Tshwane it's starting to increase, and in Johannesburg as well increase. In other words, there's more and more virus which is being circulating in the community, and therefore is a worrying sign that it could break out into the fourth wave, coming into the fourth wave. Then Hatzolidata in the Jewish community in Johannesburg. Again, we're seeing an increase. 29th of October, there were no new cases the preceding week. 5th of November, preceding week 2. 12th of November, and this last week ending 19th of November up to 38 cases. And I'm sure many of our viewers are aware of various functions which are taking place, and these, of course, can contribute to the new case in our community, these little micro super spreading events. So the virus is there. The virus is starting to increase. Yeah, you can see that sort of over here. The big question, is this now the start of a fourth wave? Well, officially, it's not yet. Let me emphasize, officially, we are not in a fourth wave. Now, this is, of course, looked at nationally. There are various indices which are examined, various thresholds which need to be met. So far, we're not in the fourth wave. But on the other hand, I think we've got to be very careful, very vigilant. I know there's a big question which many people are asking me, is, are we already in the fourth wave? Because people are planning the end of the year, holidays, the youth camps, the machaneh, and so on and so forth. At the moment, we are watching this very, very carefully. But I must say that at the moment, we're not officially in the fourth wave. Another thing which is worrying us, of course, is the vaccination drop-off. As you can see in this graph over here, the weekly number of administered vaccines is really dropping off, and this is really worrying. It's actually ironic because when we started the vaccine roll-off, there was a lot of anxiety and, in fact, criticism, strong criticism of the delay of the vaccination program. Now we've got ample stocks of vaccine, but either apathy or hesitancy or anti-vaccine lobbying, there's been this worrying drop-off of vaccination reach. You look at the number of vaccines administered over the last 24 hours, 120,000, that's really very, very low. You remember our initial target was 300,000 doses per 24 hours. Then we lowered it to 250,000, but 120,000 is really a very low figure. So this is very worrying. And there is still a gap in the high risk group, the elderly individuals. Look at those who've been immunized, 64%, 60 plus years, 50 to 59 years, 58.22%. So still quite a significant gap of those that have been vaccinated. If you look at those that have been fully vaccinated, it's even a wider gap. 60 plus years, only 57% have been fully vaccinated, 50 to 59 years, 52%. So there's still a large number of individuals that still need to be reached with vaccine before the fourth wave to ensure that there's not this overloading of the hospital system with severe cases. Then looking at individual programs, the adolescent vaccination program, also only about just over 5% of that population, 365,000 vaccines individuals being vaccinated one dose with a single dose. The population at this age group is about 6 million, so a long, long way to go. And even the healthcare workers in the Sisonke study, we had acquired 450,000 doses of Johnson & Johnson to give the second dose to the healthcare workers. But to date, only 100,000 have taken up the second dose of Johnson & Johnson. So for various reasons, vaccination still remains a major concern, a major problem. We really need to up our vaccination uptake considerably. So this is just to summarize where we are with regard to vaccination. Total number of individuals who have been vaccinated is 16 million, fully vaccinated 14 million. That's 41% of the adult population and 35% respectively. 25 million doses have already been administered, but again, we still got a long way to go. So let me come to the issue of the boosters. Why in fact do we need boosters? And I've often said in these talks that we are always in the learning curve. This is a new disease, new vaccination program, and we are still learning. So is in fact 2 doses of Pfizer adequate? One dose of Johnson & Johnson. That was the original feeling that would be adequate for a fairly durable protection against infection and against illness. Well, The largest study in the world, in fact, in Israel, where they've had a mass national rollout, they've been able to collect good data on this particular question. How durable is the protection? And what they did notice in all the age groups, in the adolescent age, or the adolescent and young adults, in the 40 to 59-year-old, and in the older group, the 60 plus, there is a progressive decline it seems to be progressive decline in protection. In other words, if you look at those individuals who've been immunized the earliest, they would have the highest rate of infection per thousand. So those who were immunized in January had the highest rate of infection, and then those immunized later would have a greater degree of protection. So this would signal that there seems to be a waning of protective immunity. And because of that, Israel and then America and Europe and various authorities have decided or implied that the primary doses, 2 doses of Pfizer, would kind of wane over a period of 6 months and would therefore require a booster to kind of boost up that vaccination coverage. It's interesting, if you look at the laboratories, in fact, you still get laboratory data, you'll still get neutralizing antibodies at a pretty high level, a pretty good, pretty satisfactory level, well past 6 months. It's 239 days, 268 days in the younger age group, the older age group, still got pretty good neutralizing antibodies. This is with the single dose of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Similar data, sorry, this is a rather busy technical thing, but really to illustrate that you still get, there's a more of a drop-off, but still pretty reasonable antibody levels after 2 doses of Pfizer at 6 months. So laboratory studies seem to say that we still do get good immunity then. And really what it does show is that these antibodies are still protective against severe COVID, even at 6 months. So 6 months, we do get more than 75% vaccine efficacy against severe disease. It's against infection where it really starts to wane to about 60% to maybe even 50%. And that really was the driving reason why of a booster dose at 6 months, after 6 months. Before 6 months, there didn't really seem to be much reason for it. Also just showing that at 6 months, there's also adequate protection against the Delta variant. So now I'm getting still many questions are coming up with regard to what do I do? And I often get a detailed history of contact and when should I isolate, what kind of contact justifies isolation. And, I get questions with a long history, sometimes more than 1 page of this one went to a dinner party and seated at the party, there was somebody who came into contact with somebody who was positive and they had a mask, but they didn't wear the mask completely because they were eating. And a long story. And I'm really being asked, well, should they isolate or should they go into quarantine? Or is it not necessary for going to quarantine? And this graphic I've shown many times. I apologize for showing it again, but I think it's important to actually go through it again because, again, many people are uncertain. It's very difficult for me to give a yes or no going through a very long history. Really, you need to be the judge. I can really only give the principles. And these are the principles. I'll go through them again. Unfortunately, this is blocking my view, but the crowding, the ventilation, that's an important aspect. Outdoors, obviously much better than indoors. Indoors, well ventilated, much better than poorly ventilated. Green is the low risk, red is the high risk. And then the duration for a longer period of time, obviously a greater risk than for a shorter period of time. Wearing a mask, obviously very important than not wearing a mask. Then the kind of exposures, someone that's just there and breathing, generating far less infectious droplets, speaking, obviously generating more infectious droplets, shouting even more. And this is really kind of gradates all the risks. The kind of outdoors, the ventilation, the extent of crowding, the distance, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, shorter period of time, longer period of time of exposure, the exposure to either an individual who's not talking or speaking or shouting and singing. And you take all these factors into account and then work out what's the risk of exposure. I've summarized it here. And I think these are the 6 important things to look at. The distance and the extent of crowding. Before the Delta variant, when we had the preceding virus strains, the WHO issued a distance it's kind of recommendation, a distance standard. If you come within 6 feet of an individual that is infected for a period of 10 to 15 minutes, we regard that as a contact. Now, of course, with Delta, which is far more contagious, we have to compress that a bit, and the risk is actually a little bit more in terms of distance, the risk is a little bit more in terms of duration. Obviously, the crowding, the extent of crowding, that is important. That becomes a factor with regard to functions. Ventilation is important. Obviously, outdoors is far better than indoors. Indoors, the indoor environment, better if there's good ventilation, if there's poor ventilation. Masks and wearing masks correctly, covering the nose and mask, or nose and mouth, a very important issue. The voice, whether somebody's singing, whether somebody's shouting, whether somebody's sneezing, somebody's coughing, or just speaking quietly or not speaking, again, important component. And vaccination. We know that vaccination is very important in protecting against severe disease, is important, somewhat lesser, in protecting someone from getting infected. So you take all these factors, all these 6 factors into account, and the kind of exposure which one has, one then needs to do a judgment call. Is the risk warranting quarantining, or is it not? I'm very happy to kind of look at individual cases, but really the final judgment call really must come from yourselves. I'm going to end off with answering some of that I think covers a lot of the questions, the boosting and also the exposure contact. I also got a question some time ago about the discrepancy in numbers between the Western Cape and the national numbers. I can't answer this. All I can say is that the national figures really don't come from any province. They come from the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. They collect data from all around the country, and those are the national figures. I've actually spoken to people from the Western Cape and who are on our VMAC, and they're not aware of any discrepancy. So all I can say is I'm not sure where that discrepancy came into. There really isn't a discrepancy between the provinces. The provincial figures are really coordinated nationally, primarily through the NICD. Then it gets analyzed by various other bodies such as the Medical Research Council and so on and so forth. I was actually going to speak also about mucosal immunity. Somebody asked me about if I could comment on the oral vaccine, which is developed in Israel and developed in the United States. Maybe just very briefly to go through it. There are the immune system is divided into 2 parts. There's a systemic immune system, which is manifested with antibodies in cells, which gives immune protection. And there's also a separate immune system, which governs immune protection for the various surfaces, or mucosa. We call it mucosal immunity. The mucosa of the nasopharynx, the mucosa of the gastrointestinal tract, of the genital tract for sexually transmitted infections. And this mucosal immune system, in fact, is integrated into one system. So when we inject vaccine into somebody, we then stimulate this, what we call the systemic immune system. That's the immune system of the organs, the blood, and so on. Some of that spills over into the respiratory tract to protect against respiratory infection, but to a less extent. And that's why we get very good protection against severe disease with an injectable vaccine, and less so with regard to the minor infections, minor illnesses, and also infection. But what one of the research avenues which is very exciting, which is being explored, is stimulating the mucosal immunity, either by an oral vaccination, which of course is very much easier to administer than an injection, or by spraying directly into the nose and throat, in other words, into the respiratory tract, and thereby stimulating the mucosal immunity. And that way one is hoping to prevent, as one does with natural infection, although unfortunately naturally unreliably so, but natural infection does protect the upper respiratory tract as well as the systemic immunity. And this is why intranasal vaccination will mimic the natural infection and protect the respiratory, and therefore try and protect infection and, in addition, the milder disease. There are not many vaccines which are given mucosally, but one of the most successful of these has been the oral polio vaccine, which of course is an extremely effective vaccine, and has been the main vaccine which has resulted in the elimination, almost eradication, of polio from the world. So this is just an exciting development. It's still very much in the early clinical trials, but we're looking at it with a lot of anticipation, and hopefully this will be one of the newer second generation and third generation vaccines, which will have an even greater impact in protection. I thought I'd end off on that more positive, optimistic note. But again, just a caution that we are experiencing an uptick of infections. So please be careful. And please, we do need to retain all those COVID protection measures. So I wish you a good afternoon. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.